Have you ever felt that suffocating sensation of being in a room full of people, yet feeling completely invisible? That moment when you realize that your thoughts, your perceptions, your deepest reflections simply find no echo in the world around you. It's as if you spoke a language that no one else understands, as if you saw colors that others are incapable of seeing. This is the most brutal loneliness that exists, not physical solitude, but the loneliness of expanded consciousness, the loneliness of one who has awakened in a world of sleepwalkers. Franz Kafka knew this pain intimately. He knew what it means to carry within your chest a clarity that burns, a lucidity that isolates, a vision that separates. Because when you begin to see beyond appearances, beyond social masks, beyond the collective illusions that keep most people comfortably asleep, you discover a disturbing truth. The loneliness of the lucid is not a choice, it's an inevitable consequence of the evolution of consciousness. It's the price we pay for seeing what others prefer to ignore, for questioning what others accept without thinking, for feeling life in a more intense and truthful way than society considers adequate or safe. If you've made it this far, it's because this pain resonates with you, because you recognize this feeling of being displaced in a world that seems to live in a reality parallel to yours. And I want you to know something. You are not alone in this journey. This channel exists precisely for people like us, who carry this heavy lucidity, who feel this existential loneliness, who need a space where their deepest perceptions are not only understood, but honored. Here you will find reflections that touch the essence of this experience, conversations that validate your sensitivity, content that transforms this loneliness into wisdom. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because every week we bring new perspectives on this journey of those who see beyond the obvious. And if this content is making sense to you, leave a like, because it helps us take this message to other people who also need to feel understood in their lucidity. The loneliness of the lucid is a phenomenon that Kafka understood better than any other writer of his time. In his works, we find characters lost in incomprehensible, bureaucratic labyrinths, transformed into grotesque insects that their families reject, trapped in castles they can never reach. These were not merely literary metaphors. They were faithful portraits of the human experience of those who develop a sharper consciousness in a society operating on autopilot. Kafka knew that lucidity is a kind of curse disguised as a gift because it makes us capable of perceiving the absurd structures that govern human life. But it also isolates us from those who remain comfortably unconscious of these same structures. It's like waking up in a matrix and discovering that most people not only prefer to remain plugged in, but violently reject any attempt to awaken them. This rejection is neither casual nor accidental. It has deep roots in human psychology and social dynamics. When someone develops lucidity, when they begin to see beyond conventions, beyond unquestioned traditions, beyond the automatic behaviors that govern the human herd, that person automatically becomes a threat to the collective belief system that keeps the group united. It's as if your clarity were a mirror that reflects their own unconsciousness back to others, and this generates unbearable discomfort. People prefer to attack the messenger rather than examine the message, prefer to exclude the different rather than question their own certainties. The experience of lucidity always begins subtly, almost imperceptibly. You start noticing small inconsistencies in people's behavior, small contradictions between what they say and do, small absurdities in how society organizes itself. At first, you still try to fit in, still believe it's possible to share your perceptions without being rejected. You try to explain what you see, try to show others the connections your expanded mind can perceive. But gradually you discover that your attempts at communication are met with resistance, discomfort, even hostility. People begin to see you as someone too complicated, too deep, too intense. They prefer superficial conversations about the weather, about celebrities, about anything that doesn't require genuine reflection. Your natural tendency to question, to go beyond the surface, to seek deeper meanings, begins to be seen as an inconvenient, even irritating characteristic. This is where loneliness begins to settle in. Not physical loneliness, but existential loneliness, the loneliness of one who can no longer be satisfied with the shallow interactions that satisfy most people. You find yourself forced to choose between being authentic and being accepted, between honoring your lucidity and maintaining your superficial relationships. And for those who have developed genuine consciousness, this isn't really a choice. Authenticity becomes a vital necessity, even if it means walking alone. Kafka portrayed this dynamic masterfully in his work. Gregor Samsa, the protagonist of The Metamorphosis, wakes up transformed into a monstrous insect, but the true horror of the story isn't in the physical transformation, it's in the family's reaction. They can no longer recognize in him a human being worthy of love and understanding. He becomes a burden, a problem, something that needs to be hidden and eventually eliminated. This is a perfect metaphor for what happens to lucid people in unconscious environments. Your inner transformation, your awakening, your evolution of consciousness is perceived by others as a deformity, an aberration that threatens the group's harmony. They can no longer relate to you in the same way because you're no longer the same person you were before awakening. And just like Gregor's family, the people around you may begin to treat you as a weight, as someone excessively complicated to deal with. The cruel irony is that your lucidity, which should be celebrated as a sign of evolution, ends up being punished with isolation and incomprehension. You pay the price of seeing truth with the loneliness of having no one to share it with. And have you felt this anguishing sensation of being surrounded by people but profoundly alone in your truest thoughts? Have you noticed how your most sincere reflections seem to cause discomfort in others, how your deepest questions are met with embarrassed silence or subject changes? If you're living this experience right now, if you feel your lucidity is being punished with loneliness, leave this phrase in the comments. My clarity is my most faithful companion. When you share this, you're telling other people who are also going through the same situation that they're not alone, that there exists a community of conscious beings who understand this unique and necessary journey. The loneliness of the lucid has very specific characteristics that differentiate it from other types of isolation. It's not the melancholic loneliness of the romantic waiting for the ideal soulmate. It's not the temporary loneliness of someone going through a difficult phase. It's an ontological, existential loneliness that springs from the perception that you inhabit a territory of consciousness that most people cannot or do not want to visit. It's like living in a dimension slightly different from consensual reality, where you can see and hear everything others see and hear, but you also perceive additional layers of meaning, invisible connections, hidden patterns that escape common perception. This expanded capacity for perception should be cause for celebration, but in practice it becomes a source of isolation because there aren't many people with whom to share these discoveries. You find yourself in a paradoxical position. The more awake you become, the more alone you feel. The more truths you discover, the fewer people can follow your conversations. The deeper you go in your journey of self-knowledge, the scarcer your walking companions become. Kafka understood that this loneliness isn't a defect or pathology, it's a natural characteristic of certain stages in the evolution of consciousness. In the trial, Joseph K. finds himself involved in a Kafkaesque judicial system where the rules are opaque, the procedures absurd, and no one can clearly explain what's happening. Everyone seems to be participating in a game whose rules they don't understand, but accept without question. Joseph K. represents the lucid individual who suddenly perceives the absurdity of the social structures governing his life, but discovers that questioning these structures puts him in conflict with the entire system. Lucidity becomes a kind of crime against the established order. This is exactly what happens in real life when you develop sharper perception. You begin to see that many of the institutions, traditions, and behaviors that society considers normal are, in fact, profoundly irrational and even destructive. But pointing this out, questioning it, trying to awaken others to it, puts you in a position of conflict with the collective consensus, and society has very effective mechanisms for dealing with dissidents: isolation, ridicule, pathologization. Your lucidity can be reinterpreted as arrogance, your sensitivity as fragility, your depth as unnecessary complication. The cruelest aspect of the loneliness of the lucid is that it's often accompanied by a profound love for humanity. It's not misanthropy that moves the conscious person, it's precisely the opposite. It's because you love human beings deeply that you can see so clearly their limitations, their fears, their mental prisons. It's because you genuinely care about collective well-being that you can no longer participate in the destructive dynamics that most consider normal. Your refusal to participate in empty conversations, superficial relationships, unjust systems doesn't spring from superiority or disdain. It springs from an inability to pretend you don't see what you see, don't feel what you feel. It's as if your expanded consciousness came with an authenticity detector so sensitive that you can no longer tolerate falseness, even when that falseness is socially accepted or expected. This creates a vicious cycle. The more authentic you become, the more you distance yourself from conventional social patterns. The more you distance yourself from these patterns, the more isolated you become. And the more isolated you become, the more you're forced to develop a deeper relationship with yourself, which makes you even more lucid and, consequently, even more isolated. Kafka knew that this forced isolation could be transformed into fuel for a very special kind of spiritual growth. When you can no longer seek external validation, when you can no longer rely on others' recognition, when you can no longer hide behind superficial relationships that mask your true nature, you're forced to develop a genuine relationship with yourself. This is where loneliness stops being just punishment and transforms into an unprecedented opportunity for inner development. You learn to be your own most interesting company. You develop a capacity for internal dialogue so rich and deep that the absence of external interlocutors ceases to be a problem. You discover that you can find within yourself the entire universe you've always sought in others. This isn't cheap consolation or defensive rationalization. It's a genuine discovery that expanded consciousness, however lonely it may be in social interactions, is infinitely richer and more satisfying than the superficial connections you gave up. You trade quantity for quality, breadth for depth, social acceptance for personal integrity. The loneliness of the lucid also teaches a fundamental lesson about the nature of authentic human relationships. When you stop trying to fit in, when you stop modifying your essence to be accepted, when you stop hiding your deepest perceptions to avoid discomfort, something interesting happens. You begin to attract people who are at the same level of consciousness as you. Not many people, it's true, but the few who appear are of a quality of connection you've never experienced before. These are relationships based on mutual truth, deep understanding, the capacity to share not just superficial experiences, but existential insights, philosophical questionings, spiritual perceptions. It's as if your willingness to be alone with your lucidity created a magnetic field that attracts other, equally conscious people, equally willing to prioritize authenticity over social acceptance. These encounters are rare, but when they happen, They compensate for all the years of loneliness you endured to maintain your integrity. It's in these moments that you realize it was worth resisting the temptation to diminish yourself to fit into the small spaces society offers. Kafka also teaches us that the loneliness of the lucid has a fundamental creative dimension. When you're forced to develop a deeper relationship with yourself, when you need to find in your own consciousness the nourishment you can no longer find in conventional social interactions, you automatically become more creative. Creativity is born from emptiness, from absence, from the need to fill internal spaces that can no longer be filled externally. Your hours of solitude transform into laboratories of self-exploration, into workshops of inner development, into sanctuaries where you can process all the perceptions you accumulate by observing the world with more awakened eyes. You develop unique forms of expression, original ways of understanding reality, innovative perspectives on existential questions. Your lucidity, fed by solitude, becomes an inexhaustible source of insights, reflections, and discoveries that might never have emerged if you had remained comfortably inserted in the social herd. Forced solitude transforms into voluntary retreat. Isolation converts into creative incubation. The process of accepting and embracing the loneliness of the lucid passes through several distinct psychological phases. First comes denial, the desperate attempt to continue fitting in, to find ways to share your perceptions without losing your social connections. You still believe it's possible to educate others, awaken the sleepers, bring light to those who prefer darkness. This phase is characterized by growing frustration because you continue knocking on doors that won't open, speaking a language that won't be understood. Then comes anger. Resentment against a world that seems determined to remain unconscious, against people who choose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. You may go through a period of bitterness, fierce criticism against human mediocrity, severe judgment against those who cannot keep up with your level of perception. This phase is necessary but dangerous, because it can crystallize into a toxic superiority posture that prevents your subsequent growth. The third phase is bargaining, the attempt to find middle ground, to develop multiple personalities that can interact at different levels according to the audience. You learn to speak different languages with different people, to measure your depth according to the interlocutor's absorption capacity. This can work for a while, but eventually becomes exhausting to maintain so many masks, play so many roles, suppress so much truth. The fourth phase is depression. The moment when you truly understand the extent of your isolation, when you realize there's no going back, that your lucidity is irreversible and your loneliness is permanent. It's the most difficult period because you need to mourn a normal social life, need to accept that you'll never again be like other people, that you'll forever carry this expanded sensitivity that is simultaneously gift and burden. Many people get stuck in this phase, developing chronic melancholy, existential sadness that can last years. But for those who manage to cross this darkness, finally comes the fifth phase, acceptance. And with acceptance comes something even more precious, celebration. You begin to realize that your loneliness isn't punishment, it's privilege, that your lucidity isn't a defect, it's a gift, that your inability to be satisfied with the superficial isn't a limitation, it's an expansion. You stop seeing your difference as a problem to be solved and begin seeing it as a characteristic to be honored. Your loneliness transforms from forced isolation into chosen retreat. Your sensitivity stops being fragility and becomes strength. Your depth stops being complication and reveals itself as richness. Kafka shows us that solitary lucid ones often become humanity's great artists, philosophers, mystics, and visionaries, not by accident, but by necessity. When you're expelled from the herd for seeing too much, when you're forced to develop an intimate relationship with yourself, when you need to find meaning in an existence that seems absurd by conventional standards, You naturally develop capacities that remain dormant in most people. You learn to transform pain into wisdom, loneliness into creativity, incomprehension into compassion. You develop a unique capacity to see beauty where others see only chaos, to find order where others perceive only confusion, to discover meaning where others find only absurdity. Your marginal perspective becomes a strategic advantage for understanding aspects of existence that are invisible to those immersed in the mainstream of human experience. You become a kind of anthropologist of your own species, observing from outside behaviors that others execute automatically from within. This position of distant observer can be lonely, but it's also extraordinarily revealing. The loneliness of the lucid also teaches a fundamental lesson about the nature of true freedom. When you stop depending on external approval, when you stop modifying your essence to fit prefabricated molds, when you accept paying the social price of being genuinely yourself, you experience a type of freedom that most people never know. It's the freedom to be authentic regardless of consequences, to express your truth without worrying about reception, to live according to your own values without negotiating with others' expectations. This freedom has a price, and that price is precisely loneliness. But for those who experience this genuine freedom, loneliness stops being a burden and becomes a small tribute worth paying. You discover that you prefer being alone, being yourself, than accompanied playing a character. You learn that the company of your own authentic consciousness is more nourishing than relationships based on mutual falseness. You realize that the quality of your inner experience matters more than the quantity of your outer connections. Kafka also teaches us that the loneliness of the lucid can serve as a kind of conscious sacrifice for collective evolution. When you refuse to participate in unconscious dynamics, when you deny feeding destructive systems, when you choose isolation over complicity, you're not just preserving your own integrity, you're contributing to a broader paradigmatic change. Each person who awakens and accepts their lucid loneliness is like a seed planted in the field of collective consciousness. It may take time to germinate, may seem insignificant in the larger context, but eventually these seeds multiply and begin forming groves of consciousness where other awakenings can flourish. Your willingness to be alone with your lucidity, instead of surrendering to collective unconsciousness, creates space for other people to also awaken without feeling completely isolated. You become part of an invisible network of expanded consciousnesses that, even physically separated, are energetically connected by sharing the same quality of perception and the same commitment to authenticity. The journey of those who accept the loneliness of the lucid eventually leads to a surprising discovery. You were never really alone. Your expanded consciousness is part of a greater consciousness that connects all awakened beings, regardless of time or space. When you learn to tune in to this subtler frequency, when you develop the capacity to communicate through non-physical dimensions of reality, you discover that there exists a community of lucid souls that transcends the limitations of conventional social interaction. You may feel misunderstood in daily conversations, but deeply connected in a more essential dimension of experience. Kafka intuited this truth when he wrote about isolated characters who, paradoxically, represent universal aspects of the human condition. Their isolation made them not stranger, but more representative of the essential human experience. Their loneliness connected them not with fewer people, but with more people in a deeper and truer dimension. The loneliness of the lucid, when completely embraced, transforms into a very special form of universal love. Because it's precisely your capacity to bear isolation, to not need constant validation from others, that allows you to develop disinterested love for humanity. You can love people without needing them to understand you. can desire collective well-being without expecting recognition, can contribute to general awakening without demanding gratitude. Your solitary lucidity becomes a silent service to the evolution of human consciousness. You learn that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply being a living example that it's possible to live authentically, think independently, feel deeply in a world that frequently rewards the opposite of these qualities. Your existence becomes a kind of lighthouse for other navigators lost in the sea of collective unconsciousness. Even if few can see your light, even if rare are those capable of following your example, you continue shining because you understand that this is your natural function in a reality that desperately needs more consciousness and less automatism.